The roar of MotoGP has always been more than noise. It is the sound of limits being broken, of men riding against the edge of physics and against themselves. But sometimes the true story isn't the speed of the machine. It's the silence between surgeries, the long nights when bones refuse to heal and vision doubles, when champions stare at their own fragility and ask the question no fan ever hears, am I finished? Marc Marquez lived in that silence from 2020 to 2023, when crashes, operations, and despair threatened to bury a career that once looked untouchable. And yet, in those moments of darkness, he found an unlikely voice that knew the abyss. Mick Doohan, five-time world champion, whispered across generations, there aren't many people you can have those kind of conversations with, because not many of us have gone through that sort of situation. It was not encouragement. It was recognition, the acknowledgement that both men had been broken at the peak of their powers, both forced to decide whether pain would end their story or ignite it. From there, Marquez did more than heal. He reinvented himself, choosing to abandon the familiar embrace of Honda for the brutal precision of Ducati. At Valencia, the data told engineers what fans could not see. Torque curves bending to his style, anti-squat systems synchronizing with his balance, and carbon forks absorbing forces few riders could even attempt. But beneath the telemetry, the fire was psychological. Marc had unfinished business, Doohan reminded us, and nothing motivates more than that, to empty yourself completely. With each lap, Marquez wasn't just racing. He was purging, transforming fear into fuel, turning scar tissue into speed. And when the 2025 season climaxed, when rivals like Bagnaia and Quartararo felt the gravity of a man who should have retired yet instead ruled again, it became clear this was no ordinary comeback. This was the proof that careers are not defined by the fractures that break them, but by the responses that rebuild them. Or as Doohan put it with quiet finality, so many injuries and so many operations take you to the deepest part of yourself. And from that depth, Marquez rose not just to win, but to remind the world that MotoGP is not merely a sport of machines, but of men who refuse to be destroyed. And so, when the engines roared at Matei and Marc Marquez crossed the line in second place to claim his 7th Premier Class crown, it was not just a championship sealed, but the visible proof that every scar, every doubt, and every whispered conversation with Mick Doohan had finally converged into triumph. The night in Matei shimmered with neon reflections as if the circuit itself understood history was being written, and Marc Marquez, with a familiar intensity in his gaze, crossed the line in second place yet crowned himself champion once again. The 7th in MotoGP's Premier Class and the 9th overall, a figure that resonated less as arithmetic and more as testament. The air was thick with paradox, because while Ducati engineers applauded their newest icon, the shadows of Honda's past victories still clung to the paddock walls like lingering perfume. For Marquez, that instant was less about points than ghosts, an unfinished dialogue with his younger self, whispering inside his helmet. Did I ever really leave, or was this the long way back? He answered himself with the silence of the throttle closing, a silence louder than any applause. The official announcement rang through the loudspeakers, but the real ceremony unfolded in the emotional tremors of mechanics, who once celebrated him in red and white, now forced to cheer with bittersweet restraint. On Honda's Instagram feed, the caption appeared like a coded poem, sometimes the number 8 ball isn't the end of the game. Congratulations from everyone at Honda HRC2 at Marc Marquez 93 and his team. It has been a journey of 1,000 miles, and we are delighted to see you back on top of the world with a 9th world championship. The words carried both dignity and mourning, like a postcard from a past lover. At that precise moment, the Ducati GP25 idled in park firm, its exhaust valves ticking cool, a small mechanical heartbeat that reminded everyone that beneath the poetry lay titanium and fire. Few noticed a subtle detail. Ducati had secretly optimized the anti-squat device for Matei's peculiar exit curvatures, granting Marquez stability that seemed like destiny, but was, in truth, science disguised as fate. The crowd saw glory. Engineers saw algorithms dancing with flesh and will. He removed his gloves with the same deliberation one removes bandages after a long recovery, and every motion became a metaphor for survival. Journalists scribbled numbers, but fans breathed myths, sensing that this was not merely a victory, but an absolution. The metaphor of the phoenix felt too easy, so instead picture an old lighthouse still standing after storms, its beam fractured yet stubbornly illuminating the sea. Marquez embraced his physio Carlos Garcia, a moment soaked in sweat and memory, as if the hug itself carried the weight of forced surgeries, endless nights, and whispered doubts. Reporters described it clinically, but in his chest the sentence repeated, "I told you I would come back." The tension built like a bowstring stretched to its limit, until the final arrow flew in the shape of recognition. This was no accident, no borrowed destiny, but the culmination of pain transformed into control. Riders watched, rivals recalculated, and fans sensed they were living through a chapter destined for legend. The symbolism crystallized: survival against despair, perseverance against statistics, unfinished business against fading light. Honda mourned what was lost, Ducati exalted what was gained, and the sport itself rediscovered why it mattered. The lights dimmed, the engines cooled, but in that silence history pulsed louder than sound. The climax arrived with a quiet that deafened. Marc Marquez had not merely won again, he had redefined what winning meant. The story of Marquez between 2020 and 2023 reads like a diary written in scar tissue, for surgeries etched not just into bone but into memory, every incision a comma in a sentence that seemed determined never to end, and yet it did not break him. The infamous crash of Jerez, the violent highside that shattered his humerus, was less a fall and more a trapdoor opening beneath his destiny, plunging him into a cavern of pain where light seemed like rumor. He would often lie awake, the night air heavy with silence, and ask himself, is this the price of flying too close to the edge? The answer was cruelly delayed by the return of diplopia, that double vision which made even the straightest line of asphalt fracture into uncertainty, a mocking ghost that transformed circuits into labyrinths. At Lombok in 2022, under suffocating heat, he whispered to Jose Luis Martinez words no one expected. He wanted to quit, to walk away, to stop chasing a horizon that seemed to retreat at every step. Martinez tried to anchor him with calmness, reminding him not to decide in despair, but even then Marquez's spirit trembled like a candle guttering in the wind. Out of that moment, however, emerged a mantra that carried the weight of simplicity and salvation. Tomorrow is Monday, and the sun will rise again. It was not poetry but survival, a sentence as ordinary as dawn yet as extraordinary as defiance. In 2022, the Mayo Clinic became the temple of his resurrection, surgeons realigning what fate had distorted, allowing his arm to rotate cleanly for the first time in years. That rotation was more than mechanics. It was a pivot back toward life itself. A little-known technical fact reveals that the rehabilitation exercises included advanced proprioceptive drills with gyroscopic sensors, designed to retrain his sense of balance to millisecond precision. While outsiders saw a man lifting weights, insiders knew he was recalibrating the language of his nervous system, letter by letter. Martinez would later admit with hushed reverence, "No one knows how much Marcus cried to get back to this moment. Those tears were not weakness but distilled persistence, saltwater proof that the body bends but the will insists." Imagine a tree in drought, its branches brittle, yet its roots clawing deeper into dry earth. That was Marquez, surviving in a season where nothing seemed to grow. Every sunrise after Lombok became a punctuation mark, each training session a stubborn refusal to place the final period. And in that rhythm of collapse and repair, despair and renewal, the man was rebuilt molecule by molecule, not into what he was but into what he needed to become. By 2024, the tide had shifted, reconstruction overtaking destruction, the rider finding not only speed but faith, carving corners not with desperation but with clarity. This arc of suffering crescendoed into triumph, proving that sport's cruelest winters can still precede the brightest spring. And as the engines roared again, the past did not vanish but became fuel, every scar an accelerant to his new fire. The climax of his odyssey condensed into one truth: Marquez did not merely return, he endured, and endurance became his ultimate victory. The realization came slowly, like a crack spreading across glass, until one morning Marquez knew with frightening clarity that Honda could no longer give him the tools to conquer, and the dream they once built together had turned into a gilded cage. He had grown up inside their empire, winning 6 titles in their colors, but by 2023, the machine beneath him felt less like a weapon and more like an anchor, each lap an argument with physics he could no longer win. In the quiet of his motorhome, he told himself, "If I stay, I vanish. If I leave, I risk everything." That inner verdict opened the path to Gresini Racing in 2024, a move that shocked paddock insiders who whispered that he was gambling his legacy for one last desperate hand. But the gamble was calculated, a wager not of ego but of necessity, and as he swung a leg over the Ducati for the first time at Valencia, history shifted on its axis. Observers noticed his body language change instantly, lighter, freer, as though the bike itself had been waiting for him, and he later admitted that just rolling out of pit lane gave me goosebumps. The GP23 carried secrets only a trained eye could spot, like the carbon-reinforced swing arm whose vibration-damping properties matched perfectly with his aggressive trail-braking style, a detail buried deep in technical briefings but felt in every lap. That test was not merely a debut. It was a revelation, a whispered promise from machine to man that glory remained within reach. By mid-2024, doubts began to dissolve, each podium a brushstroke painting over the years of frustration, until the transfer to Ducati's factory team in 2025 became less a shock than a coronation. Arriving at Sepang that preseason, he appeared transformed, 3 kilograms lighter, sharper in his movements, his body no longer burdened by surgeries but honed by their lessons. The paddock held its breath as telemetry lit up with numbers unseen since his golden years, and rivals quietly acknowledged that the old predator had sharpened his claws again. The Ducati GP25 was raw power married to electronic subtlety, and in Marquez's hands it became less a motorcycle than an extension of nerve and will. Engineers spoke of torque maps and launch algorithms, but what fans saw was a man reborn, carving asphalt with a precision that bordered on cruelty. Every corner exit became a reminder that destiny respects only those willing to betray comfort for risk. The contrast was brutal, Honda's sentimental grip versus Ducati's ruthless embrace, the past offering memory, the future offering speed. And in that binary choice, Marquez proved that greatness survives not by loyalty, but by adaptation. Each checkered flag was less celebration than justification, every lap a statement that he had chosen the harder road for the greater truth. By the time he sealed the championship with 5 rounds still to run, the decision that once seemed reckless had transformed into inevitability, a masterstroke disguised as gamble. The climax was unmistakable, resonating across garages and grandstands alike. Marc Marquez did not change teams to survive, he changed teams to rule again. The Ducati GP25 was not just a motorcycle, it was a labyrinth of power and electronics waiting for the right rider to decode it, and in 2025 Marc Marquez proved he was the cipher, bending the machine's brutal acceleration into poetry on wheels. The raw thrust of the Desmosedi engine, capable of delivering torque spikes that could unsettle lesser riders, became for him a steady drumbeat, a rhythm he could dance to rather than fear. Corner exits transformed into stage curtains pulling back to reveal dominance, each straightaway a corridor where rivals vanished behind him like fading echoes. Inside his helmet, during those tense early laps, he reminded himself, "Don't control the bike, become the bike." That intimate mantra was not mysticism but adaptation, a blending of instinct and telemetry. His late braking style, notorious for pushing the front tire to its edge, meshed with Ducati's sophisticated balance of pivot geometry and electronic aids, allowing him to hurl the GP25 into corners with savage grace. Engineers whispered about his uncanny ability to manipulate load transfer, exploiting Ducati's carbon forks in ways simulations barely predicted. The minimum tire pressure regulations, which punished many rivals with penalties, seemed to dissolve in his hands, as if he alone had cracked the code of hot air trapped in rubber, turning a bureaucratic rule into another weapon. Strategy became his hidden engine, not chasing glory in every corner but minimizing errors, a discipline that echoed his nearly flawless 2014 season. José Luis Martinez described it with the intimacy of a confidant. The best Marc shows up when the pressure is highest. Pressure pushes him to reach his best, to focus and motivate himself more. In the races where he's been most challenged, he's performed the best. That truth was visible in the numbers, telemetry sheets glowing like sacred texts, proof that his adaptability was not luck but craft. To spectators, his style looked almost violent, but to engineers it was precision disguised as chaos. A lesser-known detail emerged from Ducati's internal logs. Marquez routinely requested micro-adjustments of throttle response during sprint races, tweaks measured in milliseconds, which allowed him to anticipate grip fluctuations before they manifested. This obsessive refinement blurred the line between man and algorithm, as though the ECU itself recognized his fingerprints. His dominance was not reckless but deliberate, a tightrope walk without net, yet his balance never faltered. Watching him in full flight was like watching a sculptor carve marble with lightning, each gesture permanent, unrepeatable, sublime. Rivals shook their heads, not at his speed but at his consistency, the kind that erode hope before the race is halfway done. The climax of his technical mastery came not in a victory, but in the quiet inevitability of his control. Marc Marquez had turned the most complex machine on the grid into a mirror of his own will, and in doing so, he proved that genius is not about taming chaos, but about making chaos obey. When Marc Marquez searched for a voice that could truly understand the abyss he had fallen into, he did not find it among doctors or journalists or even rivals, but in the words of Mick Doohan, the Australian legend who had once stared down his own ruin in 1992. when a shattered leg nearly erased his career, only for him to return and rule with 5 consecutive 500 cubic centimeters titles. Their conversations, private and charged with unspoken pain, became lifelines, threads across time binding two champions separated by decades but united by scars. Doohan later confessed with disarming candor, "Marc and I spoke several times during that recovery period. There aren't many people in the world you can have those kind of conversations with because not many of us have gone through that sort of situation." For Marquez, hearing those words was like discovering a secret map etched in suffering, a way to navigate the darkness that had threatened to consume him. In the silence of his rehabilitation sessions, he would sometimes think, "If Mick endured, why can't I?" And the question became a shield against despair. The parallels were uncanny, and Doohan himself captured them with precision. Both were dominant. Both crashed at their peak. Both endured multiple surgeries. And both returned to the top against the odds. Marc had unfinished business, and nothing motivates more than that, to empty yourself completely. That idea of unfinished business became the psychological fuel, the reminder that glory was not a memory, but a possibility waiting to be reclaimed. A little-known detail reveals that Doohan even sent Marquez training notes from his own recovery era, focusing on mental compartmentalization, techniques designed to separate physical pain from competitive focus, methods more akin to meditation than mechanics. This transfer of wisdom was not nostalgia but science of the soul, a mentorship rooted in empathy and experience rather than theory. On motivation, Doohan distilled the contrast with a sharp edge. For Doohan, motivation came from a desire to keep racing. For Marquez, it was to reclaim the summit he once owned. That difference mattered, because it explained the ferocity with which Marquez attacked 2025, riding not to prolong a career, but to prove that destiny could still be bent. The metaphor that comes to mind is of two ancient trees, both struck by lightning, both scarred, yet each finding a way to bloom again, their branches twisted yet alive. When the races tightened, when pressure pressed like a hand on his throat, Marquez remembered the Australian's words and felt less alone, as though history itself whispered encouragement. Doohan's perspective on resilience struck with greater gravity. Mentally, what Marc has achieved shows just how strong he is. So many injuries and so many operations take you to the deepest part of yourself. All the effort behind what he has done explains why he's such a humble guy. And finally, this title will be especially rewarding for Marc, above all, because he came close to retiring. The time he spent injured felt endless and incredibly hard, but I'm sure that now looking back, he sees it as a period that was worth enduring. Those lines were not compliments but verdicts, the judgment of one who had lived the same torment. And in them lay the climax of this chapter. Mentorship transformed into mirror, showing Marquez that his pain was not singular, but part of a lineage of champions who had walked through fire and refused to burn. This was no abstract inspiration, but a practical reminder that resilience is not about ignoring wounds, but about carrying them with dignity. Journalists wrote of titles and statistics, but the deeper story was of dialogue across eras, of Doohan's survival bleeding into Marquez's rebirth. The exchanges between them proved that sometimes the most decisive technical advantage is not horsepower or aerodynamics, but the psychology forged when legends share their private truths. And when Marquez finally stood atop the 2025 season, crown reclaimed, the echoes of Doohan's voice lingered in the background like a steady bass line beneath the melody of victory. The climax arrived not in the roar of engines or the cheer of crowds, but in the quiet recognition between two riders, 3 decades apart, who had faced oblivion and answered with persistence. Marquez had been to the edge, stared into it, and returned, and the lesson was timeless. Greatness is not surviving the crash, but transforming the wreckage into wings. When Marc Marquez secured his 7th Premier Class crown in 2025, the statistics told a simple truth. He now stood level with Valentino Rossi, the eternal benchmark of MotoGP's modern mythology, but numbers alone failed to capture the gravity of the moment. For Honda, it was a bittersweet reminder of what had slipped through their fingers, the golden child who had once delivered glory now wearing Ducati red and reminding them of opportunities lost, like a photograph that refuses to fade. For Ducati, his triumph was ultimate validation, the proof that their evolution from underdog to benchmark was complete, and the GP25 became not just a machine but a symbol of their supremacy. Fans, weary of corporate headlines about Liberty Media's takeover, rediscovered the essence of authentic racing drama, for this comeback was raw, visceral, unmarketed, the kind of story that makes a sport breathe again. In garages across the paddock, rivals like Pecco Bagnaia and Fabio Quartararo recalibrated their ambitions, forced to reckon with a man they thought history had already written out of contention. The technical arms race sharpened, every manufacturer rushing toward 2027's regulation reset with urgency intensified by Marquez's ability to make machinery transcend its limits. In the press room, analysts framed the story as engineering, but on the asphalt it was something more primal, a reminder that careers are not defined by the injuries that break bones but by the responses that rebuild empires. Inside his helmet, as champagne sprayed on the podium, he whispered to himself, "I told him I wasn't finished." The whisper was both promise and prophecy, a line destined to echo through highlight reels. Mick Doohan, watching from afar, articulated the essence with quiet authority. His story, he said, was proof of going to the deepest part of yourself and coming back stronger. That insight carried weight because it connected eras, binding Doohan's survival in the 1990s to Marquez's rebirth in the 2020s, a chain of resilience stretching across generations of champions. A little-known detail underscores this continuity. Ducati's data analysts ran comparative models between Marquez's cornering telemetry and Rossi's prime years, discovering overlaps in braking aggression, yet it was the Spaniard's consistency under pressure that set him apart. This blending of past and present gave the 2025 season an almost mythic quality, as though history itself was repeating with subtle variations, reminding fans that legends are never truly replaced but reborn in new colors. The metaphor that best captures it is of a river carving its path through stone. Time changes the contours, but the flow remains relentless, eternal. Honda's message of congratulations was dignified, but beneath the politeness lay the ache of what-ifs, while Ducati's celebration felt like vindication, a factory exhaling after years of chasing shadows. For the fans, the real victory was emotional, a story too raw to be scripted, proving that MotoGP remains at its best when uncertainty and destiny collide. Each race became not just competition but theater, with Marquez as both protagonist and survivor, carrying scars that glowed like medals. Rival riders, once dismissive, now spoke with respect tinged by unease, knowing his presence warped the championship narrative around him like gravity bending light. The season's climax was not simply a title, but a restoration of faith, faith that sport still thrives on human defiance rather than corporate choreography. And in the end, the legacy of 2025 crystallized into a single truth. Marc Marquez had shown that greatness is not about the trophies collected, but about the abyss endured and the strength to climb out with eyes still fixed on the summit.